Good morning, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. And thank you for joining as we attempt to discuss a very important topical matter. Now, this morning, we are going to talk about the situation of crime and violence as it bedevils the country of Jamaica. And, I think that all through the years, at least since the 1970s, through present times, we have been having that discussion on crime and violence as it affects Jamaica. And there have been studies after studies, and people still have not yet gotten a pulse of what is happening and what they need to do. Or perhaps they have, but they are pretending as if they don't know what to do. It's almost like slavery, right? Slavery was in operation, right? The slave masters, when they had all of these slave resistance occurrences, right, when the slaves resisted and they protested against the system of the institution of slavery, that the masters, some of whom sometimes died during those protest actions, they were in denial that the slaves were intelligent and that they were tired of such a system. The French Revolution also could be cited as another example, that when people become very, very upset and they realize that their leaders are ignoring their plight, that they will take justice into their hands. And we saw during the French Revolution that happened, that occurred. Maybe to some extent also the American Revolution, because the British thought that they would have been able to have contained the Americans at that time, and that they would never have been able to defeat the British Navy, military, whatever you want to call them. But the fact of the matter is that it was done. The Americans defeated the British because they were definitely tired of the economic and military abuses. Now, we have a situation in Jamaica where people talk ad nauseum about crime and violence, but it seems to me that nothing is happened and nothing will ever happen. And the crime and violence will continue unabated because we're living in a world that is hypocritical, in which humans lie all the time. Lies and deception stand at the root of the Jamaican political landscape. And it's time that we also admit that a lot of our so-called academics, those who claim that they are scholarly and they're producing scholarly reports, are also not very honest and transparent with the data and with the social and economic realities. And may I suggest also the political realities that bedevil the island. In a conversation once, I think could have been in 2012, with between Marty Perkins and Lloyd Dialga. Yeah, perhaps I'm not pronouncing his name correctly. But in that conversation, when Marty Perkins was asked by Dialga whether or not Jamaica was a democracy, he says that depends on what he thought democracy was. Because as far as Marty Perkins was concerned, Jamaica seemed not to have even yet forged a nationhood, a nation state, that we don't know what the whole matter of nationality and nationhood rather, is all about. Now, the fact of the matter is that we need to delve a little deeper into what is happening in terms of the crime and violence. We shall look briefly at, this article that was written in the New York Times by Professor Orlando Patterson. And for those of you who do not know, Professor Orlando Patterson is a Jamaican professor at Harvard University. He's been there for donkeys of years, right? Since the 1970s, I think since 1970, he said he went there as a visiting professor from Jamaica, and they took him on the following year. And since that, he has not looked behind, and he has been at that institution, Harvard University, since that decade. Now, he has written an article in the New York Times, or he wrote, I should say, and that was on May 29th, 2010. And that was exactly the time when Christopher Dudas Coke controversy was happening. Now, for those of you who do not know also, there was a drug kingpin in Jamaica called Christopher Dudas Coke, and he was being requested, at least the United States requested that the Jamaican authorities give him over, surrender him, extradite him to the United States to receive legal, what should I say now, justice for what he had done, some of the crimes that he had committed in Jamaica and perhaps in the United States, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that the government, that the JLP, the Jamaica Labour Party government, which is now in power, but it was in power under a different prime minister. Prime Minister Golding at the time was the sitting prime minister. And he refused to extradite or to heed the Americans' request. Now, the prime minister, that is, he was alleging, he intimated that the United States had actually broken Jamaica's laws in terms of surveillance, in terms of, listening to telephone conversations and so forth, which the Jamaican, law does not condone. Now, eventually, the United States, sent its drones down there and, did some, killed some people, and he eventually was extradited. The fact of the matter is that this was the situation that Professor Patterson is talking about, the context, and you're looking at the context in terms of that extradition being in the process and the controversy surrounding the extradition request and the final, what should I say, in moments of that extradition in terms of you having, over 70 people dying within that constituency in which this drug kingpin lived, and also his final departure from Jamaica to the United States. Now, the question here is, well, Orlando Patterson has entitled his piece "Jamaica's Bloody Democracy." So he's saying that we live in a bloody democracy. That Jamaica is in fact a bloody democracy. Now, he opens up by saying the violence tearing apart Jamaica, democratic state. So he's describing Jamaica as a democratic state, raises serious questions not only about its government's capacity to provide basic security, but more broadly and disturbingly, the link between violence and democracy itself. So he has dealt with that topic, and he has spoken ad nauseum also about the whole link between democracy and violence. And that is true to a great extent, because when we look at what happened in Western Europe and also in the United States of America, it was violence throughout. When you talk about America, for example, the exemplar of democracy in the world, as she claims she is, the fact of the matter is that during slavery as an institution was a very violent one. The interaction, the relationship that the British also had with its Jamaican colony, right, was also extremely violent. So the fact of the matter is, whatever little democracy that the US has and Great Britain has, right, it was built on violence. Even the wealth that they have garnered was also built on violence. So there is an inextricable link between violence and democracy. I am sure that you will agree with the professor. The specific causes of turmoil are well known. For decades, political leaders have used armed local gangs to mobilize voters in their constituencies. The gangs are rewarded with the spoils of power, in particular housing and employment contracts they can dole out. Opposition leaders counter with their own gangs, resulting in chronic violence during election sessions or seasons. Now, the fact of the matter is, I think that Orlando Patterson could have given a historic background into the violence in terms of how violence it was perpetrated by also the colonial masters and during slavery. Just to say that our politicians, local politicians, are just continuing in that tradition. This is nothing new. And I think that Orlando Patterson understands that, and he should have given that historic understanding so that people can see that there is a continuation of the violence that bedevils that island. Now, these gangs eventually moved into international drug trafficking with their leaders called Dons becoming ever more powerful. The tables turned quite some time ago, with the politicians becoming dependent on the Dons for their survival. So here we see a situation in which the legal institutions were also involved in these illicit activities. And the same thing happened during slavery. We don't have to, continue to exhaust that point. But the same thing happened. There was a thin line between legal institutions and illegal institutions during slavery. And we had the pirates, right? And all of those things, that the trafficking of individuals and who was trafficking and who had license to traffic and who didn't have a license to traffic, and all of those nonsensical operations that happened during the institution of slavery. Now, a case in point is the reliance of Prime Minister Bruce Golding on the notorious Don, Christopher Coke, whose refusal to surrender for extradition to the United States to stand trial on gun and drug charges led last week to virtual warfare on the streets of the capital, Kingston, and the deaths of scores of civilians. Now, he did not talk about the fact, of the United States also breaking Jamaican laws and what implications that also might have for Jamaica as a so-called independent state, or as a democratic state, as he suggested, because he's believing, Orlando Patterson, that Jamaica is a practicing democratic state, and it is a legitimate democratic state. However, based on lots of historic understandings and the relationship between the British and and Jamaica before Jamaica's independence, and subsequently the United States and Jamaica's relationship, suggest otherwise. Suggest that the giants, the British before, followed by the Americans, have continued to have this strong stick over Jamaica's democracy and its independent state. And I think that Professor Orlando Patterson should also make that very important point in his piece. Endemic political corruption is hardly Jamaica's only problem. Add to its paltry rates of economic growth, widespread poverty and income inequality, vast urban slums, and a police force considered brutal and despised by the poor. And it is little surprise that the island nation's homicide rate is always among the handful of the world's highest. Right? So he's giving here that the factors that contribute to this high homicide rate, right? So first of all, we have the paltry rates of economic growth. This also needs to be expounded upon. I'm not sure if he's going to do that. Let's look at what he's going to do. But followed by the widespread poverty. So of course, economic growth is going to be linked to the widespread poverty and income inequality. So, there's a vast, of course, income inequality there. He talks about the vast urban slums. All of these are interrelated, and the police brutality that is on the island. Yet Jamaica, according to him, to its credit, has by global standards, according to Patterson, achieved a robust democracy. I don't understand what he means by that, because he understands very well, Orlando Patterson should understand very well, that this world is a big, what should I say now, slave plantation, and it's the survival of the fittest. It is the survival of the fittest. He knows that, especially through the Monroe Doctrine, that Jamaica is just the backyard of the United States. the United States being, of course, a powerful military power. I think Orlando Patterson is aware of that, but he chooses not to talk about these things. However, great violence during elections, voting is fair, and governments change at the national level regularly and fairly smoothly. So that is the essence of what democracy is all about, that we have elections frequently, and the Jamaicans, at the national level, they change their governments regularly and fairly. And that is true. But I think that if Jamaicans understood the system better than how they do at the moment, I'm not sure that if that would have happened regularly and fairly smoothly as Patterson is here suggesting. I think we're living in a Jamaica in which we do not know that the society in which we live is not a nation state, as it were. And I think that is what Muddy Perkins was alluding to, that I don't think at this juncture of the history that we have yet come up with a working definition of what nationhood is all about. I don't think that that is so. And one of the things I also mentioned in an article I had written for the Jamaica Observer, when Jamaica was celebrating its 60th anniversary of independence, was the fact that, yes, I think that the language, even the whole aspect of language, had we decided what language is all about and how language can be used as a way of forming culture and an identity of who we are as a people. But even that too has been tribalized. And Jamaica, for the most part, is a tribal state. It's not a nation state. It is a tribal state. And that is a fact. And that is one of the reasons why we're having the huge, rates of, or high rates of crime and violence as we see it on the island. Something that we need to think about. But I think we continue to live lies that we are this solid, robust democracy, as Orlando Patterson here is suggesting, when we're not. And this is the crux of the matter, that the whole academic situation and academic landscape has tended to, destroy and to distort the realities of what the situation is on the island. Right? But we have to be careful of that, and we've got to speak truth as it is. And no wonder people think that the Bible, for example, and you might say, why is Andrew always talking about the Bible? But the Bible is the standard. People say the Bible is simple. But do you know that it is simplicity that is the best way to live? Even talk about your diet. The simplest your diet is, it is going to be healthier for you. When we have all these complex things that we're eating, destroying our health. If we make the truth simple, just make life simple and say the truth as it is, even though it might hurt. And that's what the Bible does. The Bible is direct, and it expresses itself in a simple manner, yet profound, that we can have the transformation that we need. But what we do in our society, we, on the other hand, this secular academic system, we have everything is complex, is complicated, and we use complex language and complex theoretical framework to describe our realities, and sometimes it has nothing to do with the realities that bedevil us. But that is how the academic world is set up. And, Professor Patterson is just following in that tradition. The judiciary, if overburdened, is nonetheless independent and relatively uncorrupt. I don't think it's independent. I don't think it has ever been independent, Professor Patterson. Because if it had been independent, I think we also would have fewer. The crime and violence definitely would have been much, smaller in terms of it would have not been as high as it is right now, the rates of crime and violence. That is because, the fact of the matter is that people cannot get justice. And that is the whole point of it, because justice, the judiciary works along with the executive branch of government, and and also with the what you call it now, the economic elites, the financial elites. So I don't know what you are talking about. And you also know that in the United States, it's much practically not very different. So I am not sure what Orlando Patterson is seeing that I am not seeing. There is a vigorous free press and a lively civil society. Freedom House has continuously categorized the island as a free country. Freedom House, is it? Now, Professor Patterson is just uncritically referencing organizations, think tanks that a lot of times speak nonsense. But, that is what they are, and he's citing them, and he's, again, writing for the New York Times, right? So he has to be careful and of what he includes in this paper. Now, for most observers of democracy, and he's talking, Jamaica's violence seems an anomaly. Well, for me, it does not seem an anomaly, because, if he's just going to think that democracy means the changing of governments freely and fairly, smoothly, according to him, I don't think that that is the whole essence of democracy. And I think that my understanding of what democracy should be is that we allow truth and ideas to contend, and ideas cannot contend in Jamaica. Right? We have selective truth in Jamaica. And I was reading a book yesterday, and the author mentioned that selective truth is misinformation or disinformation. It's when you allow different ideas and ideologies to contend, excuse me, in any given nation state, that you have freedom. And that is what the whole essence of the Protestant Reformation was about in Europe. That also resulted in violence, So the entire Western world, and I think, as he's suggesting here, well, perhaps he's not suggesting, but he is actually questioning, I should say, the question of democracy and violence are inextricably linked, because the fact of the matter is that if you're going to have a true democratic state, you're going to have different ideas contending. And what we see in history is that when you have these different ideas contending, you're going to have the status quo being challenged. And for some reason, the elites do not like the status quo to be challenged, and hence violence will happen. Now, the violence can be contained to some degree if we have good policing. And that is what you have in America. You have good policing, right? It's not that they would not be violent too, if they could be violent. And America is a violent country too, but not to the case of Jamaica, because at least Jamaica does not have good policing. They don't have the facilities, they don't have enough manpower, they don't have the equipment, such as sometimes even vehicles to get to render and to dispense justice to different constituencies, right? So the fact of the matter is that, but the US has good policing, it has a good policing infrastructure, even though you might argue that sometimes it is abusive, right? Because I don't think any policing system is not in some extent, to some extent, going to be abusive. But for the most part, right, it continues, it has its intelligence gathering. And let us say something happens, a crime happens in any part of, America, be it at the mall or in a particular community, in seconds or in minutes, you have the police car there. In Jamaica, perhaps it's going to take hours, if not days, if not months, to be able to get some sort of justice, and at least someone to listen to you in terms of what might have taken place. So we have poor intelligence gathering, and I don't think we have enough manpower, and the equipment, the vehicles are not there. Of course, we are investing lots of money in into the IMF and the World Bank in terms of debt reduction. So the fact of the matter is that we are more concerned about reducing our debt than building Jamaica and building the infrastructures that are necessary for a democratic society, a healthy democratic society functioning. And I think that Professor Orlando Patterson knows that and understands that very well, perhaps much better than I do, but is not articulating it here in New York Times. Democracy is held to be inherently prone to good order and peace, and I agree with him. I think that and that needs also some aspect of policing, right? We saw what happened during the era of segregation in the United States and the violence that took place in the cities, right? And had it not been for laws that were made, right? Amendment to the laws and for policing, because even now, lots of Americans, white Americans, so-called, still do not like their African Americans and people of color, as you would call them, even though all of us are people of color. But let's say we're using the terminologies that are understood in the world in which we live, right? If it had not been for good policing and effective laws, I think that you would still continue to have the level of violence that you had during the segregation era in the United States. I think you would. But it's not that people's hearts have changed. A few might have, but for the most part, many of them have not changed, right? There's an author after the civil rights, not the civil rights, the Civil War occurred in the United States. That was from 1861 to 1865, right? The American Civil War. She said quite eloquently that slavery will always exist because slavery will never die because the spirit of slavery continues to live, which means that it continues to live in people's hearts. So not because you don't see slavery, the physical manifestation of it, because certain laws have been effected and implemented so to contain this institution, and good policing also have been set up. And the fact that Americans can be sued if they decide to take somebody's life, etc., etc., etc. In Jamaica, we do not have those effective laws, and our laws are not laws that have teeth, that are effective, that will bite, right? And allow people not to be engaged in such, in illegal or illicit activities. That's what we need, right? If we want to at least temporarily control crime and violence. So according to this democratic peace doctrine, democracies do not go to war with each other, and in domestic life, they provide nonviolent means of settling differences. Violence, writes the political theorist John Keane, is anathema to democracy's spirit and substance. That's what he's suggesting, not necessarily that is true, but that is his philosophy. That is his narrative, right? Shall we say? The fact of the matter is that Jamaica, in the context of Jamaica, we have been having an ongoing civil war since the 1970s, and it has not stopped, Professor Patterson, and you know that. We said that it stopped in the 19s after the Michael Manley's government in 1980 gave up power, and the CIA endorsed Edward Seaga was placed into office, right? You know that. So, but the violence continued even after the decade of the 1970s. So we have been having an ongoing civil war, which has not stopped. I don't know when it will ever stop. In terms of the political killings, to some extent, it might have stopped, but there is now civilians are killing civilians, and it has now seeped into or spilled over into civilian life. That political violence has now spilled into the ordinary civilian life, so people have taken laws into their own hands. And as he's suggesting here too, and the political thugs, right? The gangs, right? The gangs who were under the leadership of the political leaders, they are now the leaders of the country because they are engaged in illegal activities, in illicit trafficking of people and drugs, among other contraband. And as a result of that, they are enriched and they control the politicians on the island. And that is something that they have to understand. Now, it may or may not be true that democracies do not wage war with each other, but a growing number of analysts have concluded that domestically, democracies are in fact more prone to violence than authoritarian states, measured by incidents of civil wars, communal conflict, and homicide. And that's the whole point, that if you have contending ideologies and you're free to express yourselves, you have free movement from one place to the other, then you are going to have more violence. So in places like Cuba, for example, that is a communist state, and other communist nations in the world, you're going to have less violence because they're controlled. They are controlled. Even their movements are controlled. But when you have a free country in which people can move around freely, they can express their ideas freely, then that is going to result in some problems. And if Professor Patterson is talking about that, yeah, to a great extent, we have freedom of speech in Jamaica. People are free to express themselves, not in the official capacity, not in an official capacity, like, sending a letter to the editor of the Gleaner or writing an article, a column, being a columnist, because we find now that the Jamaican newspapers are not open to ideas. They're not open to contending ideas, and they are very careful in what they publish. But, if you want to go on a radio talk show host and you want to express your opinions, for the most part, it's accepted and people do express themselves freely and openly in that society. So from that perspective, but you still need to have some, an arena or an opportunity, I should say, in which you can express yourself in an official capacity using any of the official communication institutions that you have on the island, but that's not the case right now. The freedom of the press is not as good as it was in former times. Now, he's talking about organized crime, especially international trafficking in drugs, has become a serious threat to democracies worldwide. And we have Philia Allen and Renette Siebert, the editors of an important scholarly collection, Organized Crime and the Challenge to Democracy, argue that it is by exploiting the very freedoms which democratic systems offer that organized crime is able to thrive. Although mortifying democratic rights, these kinds of crimes need democratic space to flourish. And this is important because these types of crimes need the democratic space to flourish, which means therefore that the government, which represents the democratic space, is also cooperating with these criminals. And that is true. He talks about a third more nuanced argument is suggested by the work of the Norwegian political scientist Havard Heger, and who has shown that non-democratic regimes become more prone to civil unrest and more likely to threaten or start wars with neighboring countries as they enter the transition period toward becoming democratic. So that is interesting, right? The worst possible situation for a state, however, is for its economic transition to stall or fail before the transition to mature democracy is complete. And he's giving a lot of theoretical framework here. And this is what Jamaica now faces. For the first dozen years after independence from Britain in 1962, progress toward democracy and self-sustained economic growth moved nicely in tandem. But then the oil crisis and recession of 1973 and the efforts by the Democratic Socialist government of Prime Minister Michael Manley to deal with hard times knocked the wind from the sails of economic progress, and Jamaica has never really recovered. Right? So we have never recovered. He said, I was an advisor to Prime Minister Manley at the time. To see what happens when a country accomplishes both transitions, we need only look at the neighboring Afro-Caribbean island of Barbados, right? So he's comparing Jamaica here now with Barbados. It has a similar colonial past and became independent just 3 years after Jamaica. Yet Barbados' per capita income is now more than twice that of Jamaica. Its standard of living puts it among the developed world, and Freedom House places it on par with Western Europe in terms of the maturity of its democracy. Sure enough, Barbados also has one of the lowest homicide rates in the hemisphere, right? Well, Barbados is also not closely, it's not a neighboring country of the US. It does not sit there right at the backyard of the United States of America, even though, yes, it's considered to be at the backyard, but we are closer to the United States and on that drug trafficking trajectory, right? I think that that needs to be said, Orlando. Now, Barbados, unfortunately, is not typical Jamaica, though an extreme case is more in line with other democracies of the hemisphere, including Colombia, Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, Mexico, and even Brazil, where the treacherous joint transition to democratic maturity and economic security has been accompanied by horrendous levels of crime. So that is interesting. As the American government decides how to respond to the crisis in Jamaica, a product of the proper insistence on the extradition of Christopher Coke, it would do well to view developments there in these broader terms. Now, to some extent, America is causing the chaos. And the whole matter of the IMF and the World Bank and the sort of, well, he would have known afterwards, the primary surplus, this rigid primary surplus that they inflicted upon us, which was impossible for any nation to survive. I think it was said that, during that time, the Greeks, that people in Greece, when the IMF went there, when they were having their, their economic situation in, what was it, around 2012 or thereabout, and the people complained that 3.5, primary surplus was too much for them to be able to pay back and to deal with. And Jamaica had a primary surplus of 7.5 when it inked out an agreement with the IMF in 2013. 7.5. And the Greeks were complaining about 3.5 and 4. A much more developed economy than Jamaica is. And they were complaining that they were not able to tolerate anything above 3.54. Right? They were not able to do it. Yet, the IMF foisted upon Jamaica, a poor country, and the IMF is largely owned by the United States, a 7.5 surplus policy for them to pay back their debt. And I think that Orlando Patterson knows that. And he knows that the Americans understand what is happening in Jamaica. He knows that, but he chooses not to speak about that. The problem of Jamaica might not seem to so insoluble if Americans were to have a more sympathetic understanding of the transitional plight of this little country. If they were to understand, right? And he says, brought on in large part by the unwavering struggle towards a more mature and equitable democracy. One of the things that I find not to be something that I like is, it's the whole worshiping of democracy. It's almost like democracy is a religion. And if it were a religion that was practiced, if it were a lived religion, then perhaps I would not be complaining. But it's often this sort of blind religion that it's just there, and the powers that be stand at the helm, and they give us the instructions, the mandates of what we should do and we should not do. And that is the whole essence of what democracy is all about. And it's not the citizens living and being able to, to function freely in their society. But this is what Orlando Patterson believes. He thinks that Jamaica is, in fact, a thriving democracy. And I don't think it is. But that is what the eminent professor at Harvard University thinks it is. But he has to function in his mindset, because that is how professors are indoctrinated, to have that mindset of what this theoretical framework is saying or not saying, and ignoring what you call now the realities that bedevil us. Now, there is a book that was published. Let me see if I can go back up, because I have to. I was on page 16. It is titled here. Let me go up and see if I can find the title here. Yeah, Confronting the Dawn. Confronting the Dawn, the political economy of gang violence in Jamaica. And this is by Glaister Leslie. Let's go back now to page 16 that I was actually looking at before I paused. Now, let's go on page 16 and read a paragraph or two to end our discussion this morning. Page 16. Oh, I went down further. All right. Okay. So, right. So here he's saying it is within, I'm not sure if that person is a male or female, but it is within the context of gangs, guns, and allegations of political and police corruption that this small island grapples with violent crime. So this small island here refers to Jamaica. It is within this context of gangs, guns, and allegations of political and police corruption. So all of these are factors. And sometimes when you ask Jamaicans, it's the gangs. It's not only the gangs. Your politicians are also involved. And they might also be the authors of the gangs. And as Patterson suggested in his article, in this New York Times article, that a lot of time these gangs need the democratic space in order to function. And that democratic space is the space in which you have the executive and the judiciary function. They function within that space also, because that is the democratic organs of democracy, of the democratic state. So if they need that democratic space, they are functioning within those major and democratic organs. And you have to understand that. So the politicians are also involved, and the judiciary in many parts. Further, despite the government's and civil society's efforts to address this issue, murder rates continue to rise. Indeed, the government struggles to contain gangs that, along with their various allies, appear better armed, better resourced, and more effective. And I think, again, because the government is also hypocritical. Because a lot of times the government is in bed with these criminals. Not all of them, but it's a system. And we're not talking here about personalities. A lot of times we tend to look at personalities because that's what the media present to us. So they talk about Christopher the Coke, and we just see him. And if he had left Jamaica, which he did, then the crime and violence would have gone down, which it did for a brief period. right? Went down for a brief period because he is not the cause of crime and violence. He was just a symptom of an entire system. In the same way that Donald Trump is just a system, a symptom rather, of the system. He is not the problem or the root cause of fascism or fascist government in the West. He is just a symptom. And the gangs in Jamaica are just the symptom of a very corrupt system, political and economic system. Remarkably, however, understanding of gang characteristics and dynamics remains comparatively limited. Now, a necessary step in designing and implementing effective violence prevention and reduction strategies is solid evidence and analysis. Specifically, information on the institution's actors and instruments of violence can shift policy debates beyond a narrow focus on repressive anti-gang policy and disarmament. This report provides a preliminary overview of key trends in relation to gang and interpersonal violence in Jamaica. Drawing on several months of field-based research, focus groups, and key informant interviews, the report considers the structure and motivations of gangs, including their transnational and gender dimensions. It also offers a typology of gang violence reduction programs and initiatives, exploring their discourse, practice, and outcomes. Now, this is something that the government can also look at, and I think they gave a few solutions to how we perhaps could tackle the high homicide rates that we see on the island, right? So it's something that the government can look at. But as I'm suggesting here, and I continue to intimate, that all governments are also guilty. And I'm saying now that not all of your ministers, because there are a few ministers who are persons of integrity. But for the most part, all politicians are involved in the violence, or leaders are involved in the violence. It is a system, and we need to understand that. So often we look at the person who is coming from the lower stratum of society, and we think that they are the real cause of the crime and the violence, because, you know, we see them, they're the visible ones, but we need to look at also the invisible government, the invisible actors in this corrupt system. Or we're not going to be able to come to an understanding of the truth. We also have to study our history and see the main actors, right? From the British to the Americans and all these actors that are involved in repressing and suppressing our freedoms and our rights around the world. We have to look at what Americans like to call the deep state and the global deep state and their action towards, you know, restricting our rights and our liberties, exploiting our rights and our liberties, something that we have to delve into. It might not be something that is going to be palatable, right, for your intellectual taste, but you've got to understand these dynamics if you are to have a pulse of the situation afflicting our island called Jamaica. Thank you so much for joining. I hope to see you in another chat. All the best to you. Have a great day until then. So long.